amazing contemporary feel for what brings about change. I first learned about Bob when he was running for Congress against Berkeley Cogilan in 1966, when emerging social movements at that time, the anti-Vietnam War movements and the civil rights movement, really wanted a kind of change dynamic. And although he lost the election, at least in that district, the war was won in relation to folks who then replaced Cogilan, like Ron Dellums, who became a major figure in Congress for that change. And now Barbara Lee. Bob has had a long history with the media. He has been a journalist for 30 years at the LA Times. He had been a journalist for 30 years at the LA Times, including 12 years as a columnist. Close my mouth. Okay. He has interviewed every president, from Richard Nixon all the way through to that scalawag Bill Clinton. His words and my words. He has done, back in the 60s, he was a co-founder and editor of a publication called Ramparts, which was a really dynamic publication in that period that really helped change the discourse around politics and really constructed the sense of there's space for an alternative media. Today, he's at the cutting edge as well. He's founded Truth Did, which brings together a wide assortment of voices who are really changing both the political and media landscape as they come out with really important ways of looking at events that you won't find in the conventional mainstream media. He also is the left on Left, Right, and Center, which I'm sure many of you hear, and a left that's badly needed in terms of those discussions. And he's here to share with us today his sense, through his career and what he's doing today, ways of thinking about the media from conventional to alternative, from mainstream to social media, how we change the terms.
Great. And how much time did you say? 45 minutes? Wow. You guys get it together? I wrote the hour speech, so I'll cut it out. Let me say, I can't come to Oxy without thinking of what's wrong with our country. It symbolizes a lot of what I have to say about what's happened to this notion of the meritocracy, which was a great idea. It's why we have land colleges, why we had City College in New York where I went to school. It's why we believed in public education. And the whole notion of replacing the inherited wealth and the aristocracy, which was after all a Jeffersonian notion, with people educated, was that they would then take their experience of their village, their farming community, their city, into governing, into the media, into all areas of power in the country. And the whole hope of a meritocracy of kids who are smart, learning, and then they would advance on the basis of merit, but they would also take the experience of their youth. They would take what life was really like back there on the farm or in the city, and transfer that. Instead, what has happened really is we've seen that the meritocracy is used to separate people from their experience. Did you say I said that Bill Clinton was a scallywag? Well, that's the kindest thing I would say. I certainly refer to his personal behavior, which is turning out to be the positive part of his administration. By comparison, I'm not excusing it. There is a guy who born poor and in Arkansas and knows what it's like, and ends up in government destroying the federal poverty program, giving everything to the banks. I'm going to give you a 1 minute, you can tweet what I have to say, but I mean, a very disappointing example of what's supposed to happen. And then you have someone like Barack Obama, who, I almost wore my Obama t-shirt. But I don't want to present myself as super wise and never wrong. I get it wrong plenty of times. And one of the things I got wrong was Barack Obama. And my wife, who's here, can tell you that some 26 or 30 hours, she'd already maxed out. She was a fanatic for Obama. And 30 hours before, if for no other reason, I wanted an intelligent president, and we did get that. And with some balance, so I was very grateful. But we were down in San Diego. I was speaking to the ACLU there, and a woman who was a big bundler for Obama, and I casually asked her, I said, "It's in the bag, isn't it?" She said, "Oh, no, we need more money." And like a real schmuck, I then write a check for $500, and I get a t-shirt, which I have to this day, some kind of original artist design t-shirt. And it's really been a great disappointment, and a disappointment that I've tried to understand. I've actually gone to the school he went to in Honolulu. I've talked to people who knew his grandparents. I actually, it turned out, was at a rally with his African father in Hawaii. I didn't know until I went through the ILW, International Longshoremen Union's records, and saw that we both participated in some kind of peace rally. At least I think we did. I don't have photographs, but it seemed to me we did. And by the way, his father's argument was, don't get involved in all these wars because you won't be able to spend the money needed to help people around the world, which is really what's needed, including in Africa. And after all, that's the thing Martin Luther King stated at the end of his life before he was killed. But the longshoremen in Hawaii have a lot of good records, and Obama came from a very interesting family, and he grew up in a place in a rented apartment. I visited the apartment building, I talked to people who knew him and so forth. And then I couldn't figure out what went wrong. Well, it started to go wrong going to an elite high school, because most of the schools in Hawaii suck. I mean, they're really very bad, and I'm not putting down Hawaii, I love the place. But, the public school system there is atrocious, except for some elite schools, not dissimilar from Los Angeles, and he goes to an elite school, and then he comes here, which I gather a number of people from Hawaii come to Occidental. I don't know why, it's the weather or what have you. And somehow, I've never been able to understand it. Derek Shear, I know, is very upset about it, but he's a Clintonista, so I don't give full credit to his critique. But I do think there was something revealing about Oxy not being fast lane enough. And after 2 years, you get to the Ivy League. Columbia somehow or other, then you get to Harvard and all this stuff, and I have nothing against those institutions. I teach at USC, which I think we're a fine institution, we have good students, but there's something that happens along the way, and not always. I mean, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was somebody who managed to do the right thing. We have a good Elizabeth Warren, a law professor at Harvard, who marvelous human brain. Brooksley Born was one of the great heroes, and the Clinton administration was the editor of the Stanford Law Review. So you can rise in the system and still keep your integrity. But in the main, the force of this meritocracy is to forget your past. They're losers. Work with the winners. What's the correct answer on the SAT, on the test? What do they want? What do powerful people want to hear? The people who fund these institutions, the people who can give out the prizes, the people who can get you to the next stage, write the key letter of recommendation and so forth. And so there's something horrible about it. Now I bring it up because I was asked to talk about my own journey, which I won't be as leisurely talking about it, it's a long time. I was born in 1936. And I was thinking about it quite a bit when I talked about this. And I thought, okay, I remember when I went to work at the Los Angeles Times, I'd already had some history. I'd done Ramparts, I'd also done work for Playboy and Esquire and New Times and lots of others, and I wrote for a lot of people. In fact, was regularly denounced in the LA Times when I ran for Congress. God, they did a hatchet job on me. But somehow after my Jimmy Carter interview, I had enough celebrity or something, or pizzazz, and they wanted me to go work there. And I remember you know, and I've never had any question that I bring a lot of attitude and so forth, you know. But I did spend, you know, 4 years or something in graduate school, and, you know, I consider myself something of an intellectual, and I do think facts and logic matter, and you should document, and, you know, the I.F. Stone tradition of leftist journalism, you better know what you're talking about, or Murray Kempton, or, you know, there's a whole tradition of really great journalism, of people who were informed and respected truth and logic and so forth. So I like to think I was out of that tradition, but I have no doubt that I brought attitude and experience and so forth. And I remember my first time, and my future wife then was not quite as powerful. She then became the associate editor. And by the way, any of you have arguments with the mainstream media, don't take it up with me, take it up with her. I brought her to deflect such criticism. But I remember going across the street. I don't know if you ever saw the old Lou Grant show, but much of the action took place at a bar called the Redwood, and actually the top editor had a phone there, a red phone, and calls would come, and you could run the paper from the bar. And I remember the first time I went over, this in fact the only place, that we had a great editor, Bill Thomas, a really terrific editor. I never would put him down in any respect, a marvelous person, and he's the one who educated Otis Chandler more than anyone, and he made the LA Times a really good paper. And yet Bill Thomas would never talk to me if I wasn't getting drunk at the Redwood. And after one terrible bout with him, where I couldn't remember a word, I decided not to drink, give up alcohol, and he wouldn't meet with me again. So that was the way it worked. And it was all around this bar, the Redwood. And what hit me, because I knew, hey, I ran for Congress, and I did ramparts, and you know, everybody knew I was this kind of lefty guy, and I've always been this lefty, even though many of the people I know on the left deny that. You know, I'm now denounced in the Nation, where I'm a contributing editor routinely because I dared have some kind things to say about Ron Paul. My God, I'm responsible, you know, for every problem in the society. You know, so, I mean, yet I had this mantle or something. I'm part of this thing. I'm not ashamed of it. And so I remember going to the Redwood, and I think I didn't was that close to Narda, but I remember asking him, I said, God damn it, I thought I was the one that would have preconceived ideas. You go in that bar, and within a half hour, you realize you're with the most opinionated people in the world. In the world, about everything. Particularly the sports writers. They had everything, you know, figured out. But everyone, the political, everyone knew how the school system should work, and what the police should do, and how the Federal Reserve should work. And you couldn't have, by the third drink, they should be running the country, according to them. And so this whole notion that somehow they were just a clean slate, just give me the facts and let me figure it out, was nonsense. You know, to the degree it was clean, it was only a matter of ignorance. You know, you were dropped into a country where you didn't know the language and the history and so forth, and you tried to become an expert in 48 hours. Something of a clean slate, but basically ignorance. And so it hit me at that time that I really was not the most opinionated person here. I was actually one of the milder types, you know. And when I look back at my journalistic career, I remember the standard I tried to adhere to was keep your listening ears open. I don't know where I got it, in the 3rd grade or something. And I figured out there was absolutely no sense my schlepping along with people, whether they were not known or they were famous or whatever, or being dropped into communities, and not having my listening ears open, without thinking maybe I'm full of shit, maybe I don't know what I'm talking about, maybe you know, I'll be surprised, maybe there's a whole other wisdom here. And I think it really worked for me as a journalist. I mean, if you, I have some of my books for sale at the KPFK. I'm trying to support KPFK. They're helping us with Truth Big Radio on Thursdays at 4 o'clock. And so I have some of my books that I've donated. You can, you know, if you're lucky enough to get one of the few copies, you can make a contribution. The money goes to KPFK. But on the back of my book, I think it's this one. No, it's not this one. It's the other one on playing president. I have a blurb from Richard Nixon. I interviewed Richard Nixon in 1985, and he sent me a letter after I interviewed him. After he sent me, he thanked me for my objective coverage of his career, and you know, and I did. I did a whole thing in the LA Times, and I said, you know, and by the way, by today's standard of Republicans, Richard Nixon's a flaming pinko. This guy believed in a guaranteed annual income. Moynihan's idea. This guy gave us the EPA, which they're all attacking now. I mean, it's the start. And this guy did the opening to China, you know, after being a mass murderer, I'm not going to whitewash him, but, you know, there was at least some sanity and some sense of limits. And I got along quite well with Ronald Reagan, who I interviewed first before he was governor. I interviewed him before he was president. He was very generous with his time. I got along with Jerry Falwell. And so I'm offering this just because this is a journalistic conference, a media conference. I do think the listening ears thing is important. And if you don't do that, you don't really understand where people are coming from. You don't grow yourself. You don't learn yourself. And my wife can tell you, every morning, whether I was writing for the LA Times or now for Truthdig and others, at 4 in the morning, I think, I wake up, I can't sleep, and I've already filed my column, and I think it's all wrong, the spelling's all wrong, the facts are wrong, the argument's wrong, and blah, blah, you know, and then I try calling the city desk, and there's no one there back in the LA Times, you know, and maybe we should change that. So I'm full of insecurity about all this, and I think it's been very valuable. And my motto in journalism really comes from Lawrence Ferlinghetti. Does anybody here remember Lawrence Ferlinghetti? He's still alive, he was 94. And Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who I worked for 3 years, when I got kicked out of graduate school at Berkeley, because I wrote a book about Cuba with Louise Seidman, who's been at UCLA for a long time. I perished publishing, I yanked my money, and so I had to go sell books at City Lights for $1.25 an hour, about 3 years, and that's where I wrote my first stuff about Vietnam. And Paul Krasner gave me money to go to Vietnam. I think it was '64, and Paul Krasner, the realist, had the money because he had come up with this really brilliant thing of these "fuck communism" posters. Did any of you have them in your band? It was incredible. This was a day when you could go to jail for saying "fuck," right? I mean, Lenny Bruce and some of City Lights. So Krasner, the genius, wily genius, came up with these beautiful red, white, and blue posters and stars, and they said "fuck communism." Well, what was the head of the dorm going to do? Take it down, you know, you commie pinko, you know. And so kids got these posters all over the country, swept the nation, and Krasner temporarily had some money. And so I went to him and I said, I've got to go to this place you've never heard of called Vietnam. It cost $1,446 for a ticket, and you have to write me a check now. And he did. And that's how I was able to begin writing about Vietnam and become a foreign correspondent. Actually, I'd already been in Cuba and written that book. But I was thinking about that, you know, how did I get into this whole thing? And why didn't I go to Wall Street? It's a question I've asked myself. You know, I really do have the skills. I'm pretty good at math and everything. And, you know, and I can sell anybody anything. I have, you know, non-verbal learning disabilities of the kind that really do well on the street. And I thought about it. I thought about it in preparation for this talk. And so I'll get back to this thing of being born in 1936 and quoting Ferlinghetti. And Ferlinghetti said, and he was my boss at City Lights, but he wrote this once. He said, "Keep an open mind, but not so open that your brains fall out." And for any of you who teach journalism, I think that should be the slogan. Keep an open mind, but not so open your brains fall out. And what he means is, you know, we weren't born yesterday. We have lives, we see, we have eyes, you know, we know things. And so it's not always up for debate the way TV try, you know, hey, we got this new issue, let's bang it around as if there's no history. You know, I mean, we talk about Iran, but we don't have to mention Mossadegh. We don't have to mention how the Shah got into power. We don't have to mention why it was overthrown. We don't have to know anything about Shiites and Sunnis and their relation about Iran. You know, history doesn't matter, facts don't matter, logic. It's all boom, 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 1 minute, we're gone. And so I've taken that to be my slogan. And then I thought, well, what was in my brain that shouldn't fall out? And it really goes back to being born in that weird year of 36. And if I'm being excessively autobiographical, it's because I think that's the only way I can understand how I ended up here at this advanced age. And so, give me the hook when I've gone too far. But, how many do I have? 5? You're kidding. I have 5 minutes left?
5 minutes of the Q&A.
I'm dead in the water. I'm dead.
We'll give you a few more. Forfeit our Q&A.
I got this whole speech, I never even got to it. Shit. Well, let me just think. Let me do it really fast. Oh, okay. It's a good thing I worked on this for 3 days. This is like cable TV. You know, get out, get in the green room. Okay. But 2 things happened to me in 1936, you know, when I was born. First of all, my father lost his job, and my father and mother weren't married. My father had another family, blah, blah, blah. So when people talk to me about welfare and dysfunctional families and everything, I was born into that, okay? And my father was a German Protestant, and my mother was a Russian Jew, and they both were garment workers. And we basically lived off my mother's salary. And so I understand. And in 36, as I said, my father didn't get his job back for 4 years. He was a knitter mechanic, and a very proud man. And so I understand something about that world. And when I was writing about welfare for the LA Times, I had been on welfare for the first 4 or 5 years of my life, home relief for one form or another. I understand all of the issues and so forth. It was not an abstract issue. It was something I did have in my mind and cared about it. I also, when I covered immigration, my mother was, both of my parents were immigrants, and my mother never got her papers quite in order. My mother had come from Lithuania. She was in a group denounced by Lenin. She left after the Bolshevik Revolution, but she got arrested 5 times the first month she was here in labor organizing. She was, one of those irrepressible types. And so people always told her you can't apply for citizenship. And so even at the end of my mother's life, when she lived with us and my wife can tell you a story, she was 88, the INS then, ICE now, was trying to deport her. And I told the guy, I said, what are you going to tell your boss, Ronald Reagan, that you're deporting the first Jewish dissident to come to this country? Because she had been in the Jewish Socialist Bund, which had been condemned by the Bolsheviks and had to get here. And so there's that kind of reality. So when I've covered immigration, I go to the garment factories and I go to the field, I see my parents, I don't see the other. And it gets back to Jesus and the Good Samaritan, who's your neighbor and who's the other. And it's a very critical insight to have. And I think it's an insight both Clinton and Obama should have. But somehow it's been blurred because they've seen the other. It should not have been alien to them. So that was one big thing, the economic setting. And I grew up, early in the Depression, and I started working when I was 12 and a half, and the whole thing, I delivered milk. I went from being the poorest kid to the richest kid in the neighborhood overnight, because my Meyer-Ovish's grocery store was willing to exploit child labor and have me deliver the milk up and down the 5 floors. And so I could buy a bike finally and all that kind of thing. So I've come through that, and it has informed me very much. I'm a bleeding heart, whatever I am, lefty. And there's no question about it. The other thing that happened was Hitler. And it happened that my father was a German Protestant, as I said, and his family was still there, but we had relatives that had arrived in the 30s and so forth, and they had very thick German accents, and they played soccer and blah, 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 and they were, however, fortunately, socialists of some kind or other. They were Wobblies, they were, whatever. They were, welders and, tool and die makers and everything, but they, for some reason or other, had developed a progressive free-thinker view. Maybe one reason why they came here was because America was a place where free thinking was welcome. And on the other hand, we had these relatives in Germany. And my mother was Jewish, and my other whole family was Jewish, and our relatives were being killed and rounded up and everything. So I was painfully aware as a kid of what was going on, and it developed an incredible hostility, irrational, I have to control it, to nationalism and to religious fanaticism. I cannot walk away from it. And to the misuses of politics, to the misuses of ideology, whether it's secular or religious driven or what have you. It's not a mild issue in my life, it's an absolute passion. There's Minsky, I already mentioned KPFK, you can go. Alan Minsky, Program Director at KPFK, very good man. I had a father who was a great economist. If they'd listened to him, we wouldn't have the economic crisis, but that's a whole other story. So the other big thing, I only have now 3 minutes, the other big thing was this war. And what was startling to me, my mother used to have this game to get me to eat my food, and the bad guys, were the things that she wanted me to eat, like desserts. That was the Germans, it was the cheesecake. And the Russians were no, the Germans were the spinach. The Russians were the cheesecake. I'm sorry, I got it wrong. And then it changed overnight. But as a kid, you know, we burned Hitler's house, we killed Krauts. You know, even my father was a Kraut. So I had to go through all this. And what was amazing to me, and my view of mainstream media, was how that changed, to my imagination, almost overnight. Overnight, in my school, in the community, everywhere. The Germans went from being the most evil people, and they certainly participated in the greatest evil of modern history, the best educated, with the finest music, the highest level of science, the greatest sense of order, and, by the way, less anti-Semitism than they had in Eastern Europe and other places. And somehow they became the most incredibly barbaric people of modern history, okay? And then suddenly it was forgotten. And suddenly, oh, it was our allies, the Soviets, who are now the bad guys, and the Germans were somehow miraculously the good guys. And I never could rest easy with this, and so as a result, I've been to Germany many times. I've had bestsellers in Germany, and finally, on the strength of my bestsellers, decided to devote time to finding my relatives. I found my uncle who had been wounded in Stalingrad. You know, I found our home village to try to figure out how this happened. And that whole experience, you know about it if you read Hannah Arendt and the banality of evil, and you know we can discuss it if you want, has inoculated me against this primitive anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, anti that you hear all the time, that drives our debate. I know what hogwash it is, I know how trendy it is, how politically convenient it is, and how it misses the whole point of the human experience. You know, and it's in my blood. So if I think of the kind of journalism that I have been involved in, it's been attempting to set the record straight on those two big issues. Okay? Now the other final thing I want to say about journalism and the mass media, and this was really what I was going to spend some time leisurely doing, but let me do it in 1 minute. You know, I'm used to speaking for 3 hours because I have 200 students in much bigger auditorium, and they, you know, because it's going to be on the test, everybody says, yeah, keep going, keep going. You know, it's not going to be on the test, so okay. But the real issue in terms of my relation to mass media, first of all, I don't want people to be cynical. I think cynicism is a cop-out. So if the game is rigged, if the world is against us, if there's nothing you can do, in my lifetime experience, people became opportunists, people became indifferent, they did not participate in their society. And on the other hand, I saw people participate in movements, whether they were covering them or whether they were part of them and so forth, that seemed quite forlorn at the time, and yet became major success stories, and you know those movements. But I remember when the civil rights movement was a forlorn cause, and nobody talked about it. I remember being a St. Louis Cardinal fan when they won, a small thing in your life, but I was 10 years old when they won the World Series against the Red Sox, and I cheered them. I don't know why, probably the beginning of my radicalism, that I didn't want to go for the Yankees or the Dodgers when everybody else did. And then a year later, my hero, Enos Slaughter, spikes Jackie Robinson going around first base. You know, and the Cardinals, who were the most southern team, let out a black cat. You know, and they are the most racist team. And there I am, left alone in the Bronx to explain the racism of the St. Louis Cardinals. You know, and my best friend, a guy named Carl Jurgens, you know, a Negro, as we called it those days, Uncle, very famous artist, Max Jurgens, couldn't play baseball, and yet he was unquestionably the best athlete in the Bronx that we knew of. You know, and then suddenly that could change a little bit. So I know that the civil rights movement didn't start with certain dramatic events. I happened to be in Plains, Georgia, before I ever heard of Jimmy Carter. I was there in 1960 with some people who were doing some civil rights stuff. I was in Koinonia Farm, an integrated community up the road from Plains, that we used to have appeals in the Nation magazine and others to support them because they were being bombed and shot at, because they actually had integrated living on the basis of a biblical communism or whatever they thought they were doing, kind of a utopian community. So I understand, and I think, just to fast forward and end, because they're going to give me the hook right now, I think of the mass media. And the mass media wasn't interested. Throughout my life, the mass media went along. The mass media wasn't interested in the treatment of the Jews. But what else was happening, during World War II? There wasn't much interest in civil rights. You had to go to the counter press for that information, to get that. And it came very late in the day. They weren't interested in the ridiculous involvement in Vietnam that ends up killing 3.5 million people. No one could ever justify. Never made any sense. The New York Times, with some very few exceptions, Homer Bigger and later David Halberstam, but in the main, cheering it on. And I'm just going to end with one example of that. I didn't choose radical journalism because it's better. I always went wherever you can get the word out. I'll print anywhere. I wrote for Playboy. I'll print. To me, it's putting your billboard up in the subway. I remember at Ramparts, and it's a very good book by Peter Richardson, A Bomb in Every Issue, if you haven't read it, on the history of Ramparts. Did a great job. It was out 2 years ago. And the New York Times actually gave it 2 very good reviews. But he points out that because we had the pictures of the children in Vietnam who were being killed and injured, and Martin Luther King saw our issue at an airport, and he decided at that basis that he had to speak out against the war. And when he spoke out against the war, the New York Times editorially denounced him. He called the United States the major purveyor of violence in the world today, and he said, how can I not speak out against that when I'm urging nonviolence on kids in a ghetto community? And he spoke out, and the New York Times denounced him for disorienting the civil rights movement, undermining it, splitting it, and so forth. And we published it in Ramparts. Martin Luther King gave us the exclusive right to publish it, because he wanted the whole statement that he made at Riverside Church. So, in my mind, you need alternative media because the mainstream media, the big media, will fail you. Yeah. And it will fail you because of the nation of ownership, power, and what have you. However, I say use it whenever you can. Use it. I'm not a purist. That's why I was at the LA Times for 30 years. However, I always kept my right. I was very clear about this. If you don't want to print it, I have the right to print it elsewhere. That was something Otis Chandler went along with, Bill Thomas went along with, and so on the few occasions when it looked like they might not print something, I was able to go downstairs and say, fine, your paper, but let me give it to the nation. And in fact, I did that with the last story I ever did for the LA Times, and the reason I went to become a columnist instead of a reporter. It was on welfare. It was on Forest City, Arkansas. It was on the lie of Bill Clinton of Project Success, and they thought they had enough already, and so I did it as a cover in the Nation. And I finally, because I haven't covered really what I want to cover, the economic meltdown, and if you read my book, you'll see the mass media was totally complicit. Totally. Why? And I'll give you the 1-minute explanation. They wanted deregulation primarily. They got it. What did Clinton represent? Deregulation, first of all, represented ending the federal poverty program, called welfare reform. Terrible. Okay. Secondly, the media, all these people wanted telecommunications reform. They always use the word reform. As a result of this telecommunications reform, cheered on by the mass media, you could have a radio station and a newspaper in the same market, blah, 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 to get this energy. That's why the LA Times went down. That's why the Tribune Company bought it. That's why they went into bankruptcy and we lost our retiree health plans, okay? That's the reality. But the newspapers were so involved, and the TV stations, with this deregulation. That was the mantra. Here comes Clinton along, and there's 2 bills, and I'll leave you on this, that they passed. And which both were cheered. I don't have time to read from my book, the New York Times editorial, what have you. One was called the Financial Services Modernization Act, which reversed Glass-Steagall and all the other sensible rules of the road left over from the New Deal, out the window, and the New York Times, I can read you the passages in my book, I mean, just thrilled to it, both in their news reporting and on their, so did the LA Times, obviously the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, what have you. And a year later, the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, again, which they cheered on, which allowed the collateralized debt obligations, the CDOs, and the credit default swaps to be totally unregulated. Titles 3 and 4 of that legislation said no existing regulation or government regulatory agency will be able to control these devices. That's the basis of the whole housing boom, the meltdown, and this thing that has cost us over $10 trillion. So, and that was cheered on by the mass media. So if you need, forget about, I mean, there was a Iraq War, of course, which the mass media cheered on out of cowardness. But if you want a current example of why you can't rely on the mass media, is because the ownership doesn't have to be GE, which owned NBC. You know, it doesn't have to be that blatant. The fact is, the owners of these ventures have the perspective of the 1%. It's just a reality. There are individual editors and journalists who can stand up against it, who can challenge it, but in the main, that's where they're coming from. And that's what the conversations are going to be at their country clubs, you know, and power lunches, and they're going to push things in that direction. And that's why they were very late to cover the Occupy movement. In the end, when the Occupy movement gets, I hope it's temporary, destroyed, who does it? It's the mass media talking about all the confusion and what do they really want and everything, you know, what are they really programmed, and it's liberal mayors primarily sending the cops in to smash people who are exercising a right that is clearer in the First Amendment than the right of free press. The right of citizens to peacefully assemble to redress grievances. And if you can't address grievances at City Hall, you know, or in Oakland at City Hall, I've been at, you know, both of those encampments, and I've spoken to them, where the hell are you supposed to do it? You know, and yet the mass media went along with that. So I'll end on that note.
Two questions, but depending on how long the answer takes, we only have one. So, this gentleman is hand up first.
In an interview at Caltech on his book tour, Walter Cronkite, and I paraphrase, said the problem with media today, particularly broadcast media, is we no longer have journalists, we have reporters. What would you say to that?
I really very much like Walter Cronkite, and I got him to know him at the end of his life, and I respect him. I don't think that's it. I don't think CBS in the great days was great. There was some good reporting, but the things I mentioned before, class has never been discussed by the mass media, by the big media, in any serious way. We had this mythology of a classless society. I know I'm long-winded, but these are important questions. The whole mythology of the classless society was very convenient to people who have top power, and that was always the conventional wisdom, never examined in any serious way. It took people like Michael Harrington or Gabriel Coppola or others to question their income distribution and so forth. That puts too much pressure on the individual reporters or what have you. The main thing is careerism trumps everything in this country. Let's just face it, it's not God. If you cared about God and you read scripture, right, you'd know usury is a sin, you ain't going to heaven. I mean, let's face it, the scriptures couldn't be clearer on the economic stuff. You know, maybe confused about gay marriage or abortion, but it's very clear on the economic stuff, you know, and yet it's not part of the discussion. Social justice is not part of the discussion, you know, and certainly not internationally. You know, Apple being a very good example. I mean, the whole soft treatment of these companies that are exploiting labor around the world, and no right to, human rights is never considered the right to be in a union, or to organize, or any of the things we even guarantee in our Constitution. So I think Cronkite was a great man himself, but I think that misses the point. I don't think Paley was great. CBS was used as a front for the CIA. I did that story at the LA Times. They went along. They were cheerleaders for the war efforts, the Cold War, which was an absurdity always. I ask you, you have the Department of International Studies, you probably don't even go to Occidental. Those of you who do, the two, I asked you, they probably have an Department of International Studies here. They probably have all sorts of experts. Ask them how any rational human being, and certainly an educated person, could ever believe there was an international communist conspiracy with a timetable to take over the world when there weren't two communist countries in the world that could even have diplomatic relations on some kind of decent basis with each other. Everybody knew that. The Chinese and the Russians were firing at each other, you know, in the late 50s. Early 60s over their border. What happens when we lose in Vietnam in the most ignominious defeat in American history? None of the dominoes fall. Nothing that they had said happens. You know, exactly the opposite happens. Communist Vietnam and Communist China go to war. Over their border, over their islands, and they're at war now over space in Costco and Walmart. Okay? And you would think this would induce some humility on the part of experts, on academics, on professionals, on the Tom Friedmans of this world. None. You know, logic, fact, does not matter. Careerism. Positioning yourself rather than taking positions. That's their slogan. I have to mention, by the way, you can't cut me off before I give a pitch for Truth Day. Because that's supposed to be, okay. But you got to give me a closing minute on Truth Day, or my publisher will have my head.
Let me give you a pitch. I read The Great American Stick-Up and I loved it. I read The Great American Stick-Up and I loved it. I'm 65 years old. I'd like to propose a title in the topic for a new book for you or for somebody else. Considering what my generation has done to the environment. My generation has allowed America to become a fascist state. My generation has allowed America to become the largest military empire in the history of the planet. Somebody should write a book, The Worst Generation. That's what we have been.
You know, I'm not gonna pander to this self-hate here. I don't believe that. I think I don't believe that at all. I think we have been a great generation. I really do. And frankly, when I go around the country, a lot of the people that are still doing stuff, including right now here, are people who are veterans of that and are part of that generation. And I see it everywhere. I see it in inner city schools. I see it, you know, all kinds of around the country. When I run it, not that plenty of them have sold out, but when I look at what scares me is the number of people that have a social conscience are disproportionate from that generation. And that what's happening now, the combination of economic insecurity for this generation, which is very palpable, and you know, the brainwashing about the SATs and blah, 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 you know, has led us to an amoral group that wants to get that career. So even when they go into Teach for America, most often it's to get to law school, you know. And I don't blame them, by the way, at all. I love our students. I think they're smarter than we ever were. If you get them interested in anything, because of the internet, which I wanted to celebrate with Truth Day, because of the internet, I bring in John Dean. They've never heard of him. No one in high school ever talked about Watergate, blah, blah, blah. By that weekend, they know more about Watergate and John Dean than their parents and their grandparents. Okay? I bring in Ron Colbert and I show Born on the 4th of July. They never really thought critically about Vietnam. Again, by that weekend, they know more than their parents. Why? Because they have the internet. They can Google it. They can find it. They can get the information if you get them interested. They got the brains, and they have, you know, there's moral fiber there. You have to educate. You have to teach. The main teaching that's done is careerism, opportunism. That's the coinage of the realm, you know. The universities, how can we position them for the good jobs, and how can we get the money from the, you know, pirates who made all this money to contribute? And there's an incredible cynicism. I don't want to feed that, you know. Let me say something about Truth Day. When I got fired, basically, I don't know why I said that, I got fired from the LA Times. I sometimes say I left. Bullshit, I was fired. And it's funny, the reason I'm confused about it is that all the people who fired me tell me they didn't support it. And they're still my best friend, you know. So I don't know who did. I mean, you know, one guy, this guy Johnson, was the publisher. He now works for the Food King. What's his name? Burkle. He's saving the world like Clinton with some altruistic foundation. So at any rate, you know, people said, oh, you know, I've heard this lots of times in my life. You know, I got pushed out of Ramparts, for Christ's sake, by David Horowitz. I wasn't left enough. That's before he became a right-wing machine. You know, so I've been around the block losing jobs and so forth. My secret to happiness, for those of you who are interested in a career still, I have, my secret for happiness is have 3 or 4 balls in the air at one time. I work 5 jobs now, you know, and I do it because if somebody doesn't want me to do what I'm doing, I say, great, you know, this is my fuck you money now. You know, that's what they say in Hollywood, you know, I got fuck you money, I don't need you. You know, you need me more than I need you. And so I don't have to go for the speaking fee, and I don't have to go for the consulting, and I don't have to do what I want to do. And I work, so that's one lesson. The other is, life goes on, and you can reinvent, and you can make opportunities, and not make it an excuse for copping out. And so, I'm not saying you're doing that, but for instance, so I get pushed out from the LA Times. Well, what, is life supposed to end? You know, we started Truth Dig. You know, and you know what? I'm still syndicated. I'm still peer. I'm read by far more people than I ever was read at the LA Times, because the LA Times was proprietary. It had to go out on their wire. These days, you even have to pay to get it. You have to pay to get to the archives and so forth. And it's thrilling to edit an internet publication like ours. We get upwards of 2 million unique visitors a month. You know, when we run Chris Hedges, who was pushed out of the New York Times, right, for daring to give a commencement speech addressing the, you know, what happened with the Iraq War, and their most distinguished reporter for 20 years in the Middle East. So we publish them every Monday, and when we, you know, you know, Hedges, you know, we can get millions of people to come to Hedges, and everybody steals it anyway, all over the world. You know, Belfast, you know, Shanghai, people are running it, you know, and so there's something incredible. I don't want to make it, it's a fragile thing, the internet. It can be shut down, as we see in Egypt and China. It will not always be there. We have to fight for it. But at this stage of our history now, let me tell you, it was incredibly liberating for me. You know, and I'll tell you that my slogan for your conference and everything goes to A.J. Liebling. A.J. Liebling, the New Yorker media critic, once said, "Freedom of the press is guaranteed only to those who own one." Tweet that, you know. And the great thing about the internet is it gives people the ability to own one. If you have something to say on any subject, you know, something scientific, about medical, you know, foreign policy, and you have something to say, you can find an audience. And we find a tremendous audience for, again, people like Chris Hedges.
For now.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. So if everyone wants to take a 1-minute stand up and stretch your arms break, and anybody who came in late, we have a bunch of seats up here. Not late, even when they did. And we're going to transition real quickly to our panel because we're starting a few minutes late, but we'll just let it go over 5 minutes. So stretch, move up, do other speaking events, and we occasionally do some actions, and we've done some research in the past, and we're really open to whatever ideas people have about what we can be doing to improve media for ordinary people in Los Angeles. So if you are interested in getting involved, make sure you contact one of us, make sure you talk to one of us at the Green Badge.
And thanks, Robert. That was a great introduction for our panel this morning. You know, a great segue was what you were saying about freedom of the press is owning your own press. And so what we're going to do this morning is talk about how local media here in LA is adjusting to changes with the digital environment. What they're doing, instead of complaining about a lost golden age of journalism, these folks are actually doing something to address the changes that are happening online and to get the news out, to share information. Just to quickly introduce all of our panelists, first to my left is Maria Armudian, who is host and producer of Pacifica radio programs, the Scholar Circle and the Insider. She's also a fellow at the University of Southern California International Studies, Center for International Studies. Next to her is Sharon McNary, who is Public Insights Specialist at KPCC, Southern California Public Radio. Thanks for being here. Next to her is Jesse Thorne, who is the host and creator of Bullseye, which is a radio show and podcast. And she's the founder of MaximumFun.org. And finally, we have Val Zavala, who is Vice President of News and Public Affairs. Thanks so much for being here. So what I've asked each of them to do is to give a quick introduction of how they're interpreting this issue about the future of news being now. And I've got this, I didn't show you all yet, but I have this nifty Prezi up here that zooms and stuff to show your website. So I'll show that when that comes around. So, so they're each going to make a brief statement, and then we're going to have a short, I have some questions for them and some discussion, and then we're going to open it up to the floor and have y'all ask questions too. And I guess the main rule that we have today is no kvetching. We feel like that's done a lot these days about how things could be better, but we want to be very proactive and think about what we can do to use the tools we have to get the news out and tell the truth. So Maria, if you could go ahead and start.
I thought I would start, I'm Maria Armudian. I thought I would start first with kind of a context of what we're dealing with today, being such a different time than yesterday's mass media. But I think that the main thing I want to start with is that no system, certainly not a democratic system, can function without accurate information, really solid information, good perspectives. I mean, even a biological system can't function without the right information. Think about DNA. And information is the DNA for a social system, just like your DNA is what makes your body function. It's information. When the information is flawed, things malfunction, systems malfunction. And if you don't have the proper information and perspective and context and backgrounds, how can we make decisions in a democratic society? And we are in a democratic society where we get to participate in what is next and what our governments do and who is representing us and what we want them to do. So, you know, as we were talking about, gone are the days where we had a couple of daily newspapers and the broadcast networks, and now we have really kind of a morass of information from which to choose. And I think it's good and it's bad. It's good because all of us get to contribute to this public sphere that allows for a lot more perspectives of information that maybe the few gatekeepers, that's what they called them, in mass media might have missed. You know, they can't do everything. They're going to miss some things. But at the same time, there's a downside, which is we also don't have the gatekeepers who kept misinformation out, blatant lies out, you know, polarizing frames out. And so what happens in a system where societies split up and only go to one source or one group of sources and the other one goes to another group of sources? You end up with this kind of polarization and fragmentation, and people can't even agree on fundamental information. That is a problem in a society, and we've seen it. I studied it for my book, Kill the Messenger. I studied this, what happens when you get a polarized society, and it can be pretty devastating, especially when you end up with what I call, you know, blame frames and hate frames. But here in the U.S., since we're talking about here, I just thought I'd throw out a couple of, you know, things that people believe. And, you know, we have to ask ourselves, where are they getting this information? This is a Harris poll in 2010. 20% of Americans believe that President Obama was pursuing, quote, many of the same things Hitler was. Those with either a high school education or less were less likely to, were even more likely to believe this comparison. 24%. Divided by power, divided by party, the numbers were really striking. More than 1/3 of Republicans believed the Obama-Hitler information. In the same poll, among Republicans, 25% believe that President Obama may be the Antichrist. Across all American adults, 14% believed in the Obama Antichrist connection. More than 1/4 of American adults, 29%, believe that Obama, quote, this is the thing, wants to turn over US sovereignty to a one-world government. That he resents American heritage, and that he is the, are you ready? Domestic enemy that the US Constitution speaks of. 29, that's 1/3 of your fellow Americans. So I think what we're dealing with today is journalists for a long time have tried to establish a standard, an ethic, the 2-source rule, maybe even a 3-source rule before they would report something, and that has kind of gone out the window. Not among the ethical journalists, but among a lot of people within the internet. And it's creating this sort of, what do we believe? And there's, in some situations, we even have bloggers who are getting paid to write information that is going to cause polarization. I heard from some city council members, for example, who said, a blogger called them and said, if you don't give me a contract, I'm going to run with this information. That's pretty unethical, and it's completely the opposite of what ethical journalists are trying to do. So, with this fragmentation, you have the institutions that are really trying to do great journalism, that are facing dwindling resources, and they're not able to reach those audiences. You have a collapse of some of these institutional norms. You have polarized Americans. Some of these consequences have really big impacts, like in climate change. Back in the heyday when Al Gore was doing the documentary he did, you had most Americans, 77%, really understood there was solid evidence of global warming. But by 2010, what happened right before 2010? ClimateGate, all over the blogs, right? 40%, only 40%, that's a huge drop, understood the scientific realities that we were facing as humanity. And only 12% were really worried about it. It's kind of no wonder we got no policy to deal with things like climate change. So with these limitations that ethical journalists have in trying to reach, I don't want to call it across the aisle because it's not really an aisle, but into these other communities and disabuse them of misinformation and convince them that, they're not being governed by the devil, that these are all people trying to do the best that they can do and trying to understand the policies and the reasons for them and the contexts and the backgrounds. There are some emerging really great things that are going on at the same time. And they're going to talk about some of them, and I won't steal any thunder from them. But just a few of the projects that I thought there's these new models emerging as a result of the internet. Collaborations across borders. It's really profound when you see that people from the Middle East, people from the Far East, people from Africa, people from Central America can come together on a website, something like Global Voices, and there are many of these, and share what their experiences are so we can get this shared humanity and learn about each other. That's one thing. There's an emergence of investigative reporting on a nonprofit level. So there's this nonprofit media that's emerging. And I'm sure we'll talk about some of it. ProPublica is the big one that has been contracting with some of the traditional news outlets. At the same time, we have these open source media that are emerging where all kinds of people contribute to a media source. There are problems with that sometimes with the accuracy, as we see with like Wikipedia, for example. Sometimes there's false information in Wikipedia. But they give you the sources and you can trace down the sources. This is kind of a profound development. Love them or hate them, WikiLeaks. This is like a new model that has emerged as a result of the internet, where there are now there's this enormous amount of information where political scientists like me can go digging through this data and try to make sense of it, just like my colleagues on this panel can. So each of us now get to make this contribution and partner with the other journalists in bringing together these perspectives that may be missed or this information that may be missed. And each of us think about what is that missing piece. My contribution has been two things. One is I saw that one thing that's missing, since I'm in academia, I was like, there's this missing element in media to be the bridge or the portal into all that knowledge that scholars create and learn and find out. And so I created this thing called the Scholar Circle, which is here in LA, it's on KPFK, on Sundays, where people get to actually hear these scholars interact with each other about something pressing right now. Tomorrow it'll be homelessness. How did we get here? What are the real solutions? Why aren't we looking at this? How are we letting a society fall, a huge section of society become homeless and look away? But it's like this every week. And then the other contribution was I actually studied media and what the effects are and tried to bridge what the scholarly knowledge is with something that's readable for the public in a book that I just wrote called Kill the Messenger, The Media's Role in the Fate of the World. But this is something that we all get to now participate in and work with. And I think that each of the panelists works with their constituents and their listeners all in a very unique way. And I've gotten to hear some of it, and I'm just amazed at what they're doing. So why don't I turn it now to Sharon?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Maria. Appreciate the way you set that up for us. My name is Sharon McNeary. I do public insight journalism at KPCC, Southern California Public Radio, 89.3 FM. I listen online, so I forgot what the numbers are. What I wanted to tell you about very quickly and very pragmatically is a different kind of way we bring sources into our journalism, different ways that we include the public in the investigative, the arts, the feature, the breaking news journalism that you hear on KPCC and that you read on kpcc.org. It's called the Public Insight Network. We are one of about 54 partners in a national network that has right now about 160,000 people who've agreed to be news sources for all different kinds of media. When I go into the network, which is a big database, I can see contact information for about 80,000 people nationwide. And I've come into individual contact with about 3,000 of them over the 3 years I've been doing this for KPCC. About 6,000 of them have either answered one of our questions or agreed to sign up to be a news source for us in the network. And while is my slide up?
Yeah.
Okay, you can all right now go to your smartphones and become news sources yourself at kpcc.org/network. It'll take you to a questions page. Any question that you like there you can answer. I recommend the expert question because everybody's an expert in something. So what we're doing is we're doing a lot of public outreach. We're reaching beyond the ranks of the traditional friend of a friend that desperate reporters turn to when they have a tight deadline and a hole they need to fill in a story. We reach beyond our listeners and our readers because we're doing outreach on all different types of locations. I'll give you an example from just the last week. When the Miramonte child abuse story broke, we could run and try and keep up the latest teacher arrest or the latest attorney pronouncement of some little child who got touched in the wrong place. But honestly, because I've been in touch with teachers who've had issues with the quality of LAUSD for 3 years since I started reaching out specifically to teachers. I had a collection of teachers I could do a very rapid question to. Hey, what are we missing in this story? What should we be looking at that we don't know look at? What I started getting immediately was, did this guy's credential get pulled? Did he get paid to walk away with, his record intact? What are the bigger systemic questions? Was this guy disciplined in the same way that LAUSD has a record of going after teachers who have done very minor things, yet get sent to these limbo places to just get paid while they do no work at all? So in talking to teachers like that, it led us to experts. It led us to break not the LA Times, not any of your big owned and operated TV stations. It led us to break a story of how this one teacher, Mark Burns, was paid $40,000 and his record fully reinstated while the LAUSD knew there was an investigation against this guy. They paid him $40,000 to retire with his record intact. And our next story that we broke, not the LA Times, not the big owned and operated TV stations, little KPCC, public radio, that this guy's credential to teach in any school system in the state remained intact for 6 more months until the district attorney brought charges against him. The LAUSD broke its own rules. It broke state law and failed to notify the state. We wouldn't have known about where to look without the expertise of ordinary teachers in the LAUSD system. Part of how we reached the teachers, and we're gathering a number of more teachers to tell us about how they've gone through the discipline process. We reach out to blogs, other media, affinity groups. I think Dick in your LA Progressive is running one of our questions right now. It's just a link. It's just a link that takes you to a forum with some questions, and then people respond to us confidentially, because that's one of the promises we make. If I can talk more about this later. I hope I've intrigued you enough to want to know about how you yourself can do this exact same kind of outreach in journalism. Anyway,
Tell how many names you
of people in our network. At KPCC, we've got about 6,000 people who've agreed to be our sources. But I mean, I sent out an email yesterday to 1,800 people, Californians, saying, hey, if you had a vote in Super Tuesday, who would you support and why? And so interestingly, I'm hearing from Democrats who are going to cross party lines and vote for Santorum in June. So anyway, that's just a little sidelight. I'm surprised. A lot of Democrats are telling me that. So
It's not
open
good.
primary, rock on.
Well, I should say, I mean, I'm not a news journalist. I'm a sort of half entertainer, half, I guess you would say, feature journalist. Just sort of background on what I do. I started my radio show when I was in college at UC Santa Cruz. I'm now 30 years old, so it's been 11 years. I started the show when I was 19. And I did the show through my college years, and when I graduated from college, I moved back home into my mom's house in San Francisco, and I had this conversation with my then girlfriend, now wife, and it sort of went like this: I guess I should quit my show. And she said, yeah, but you don't really do anything else. And I said, yeah, okay, point taken. And so I started borrowing my mom's car, because I didn't have a car at the time. Well, I did. I had an 82 El Camino, but it was not a car that you wanted to drive over the mountains between San Francisco and Santa Cruz once a week. So I started borrowing my mom's car once a week to drive back and forth to Santa Cruz to do my college radio show, which is a little pathetic. It's a little bit like the high school quarterback, like putting on his Letterman's jacket and going back to high school once a week to like sell hot dogs at the game or something. But I kept doing my show because, as my then girlfriend said, it was the thing that I did. And I did the show as my, just as a, I don't know what I was doing it for. As I was applying for jobs, and I had a horrible time trying to get a job in public radio or frankly anywhere else when I graduated from college. I graduated from college in 2003, and I don't know, just getting a job when you get out of college is really hard, as it turns out. And I applied for hundreds of jobs in radio and lots of jobs elsewhere, and just had a bear of a time getting a job. I ended up getting a part-time job as an administrative assistant at a nonprofit. So I was working part-time at this nonprofit and making $12 an hour, 25 hours a week, and that was sort of my income. And I finally made it out of my mom's house, so that was good. And podcasting got invented at the end of 2004. And I, at the time, was putting my show up on my website as real audio files and getting a few dozen people listening every week to the show on the internet, which I thought was pretty cool. And we had a pretty significant following in Santa Cruz. And I figured, well, if I can get 100 or 200 people to listen to my show on this podcast thing, then it's probably worth the extra couple of hours of work to make it into a podcast. Because would I do a couple hours of work to go to a place where there was a couple hundred people to listen to my show? Yeah, probably so. And within a couple of months, I had a couple hundred people listening to my show via podcast. And then Apple iTunes launched podcasting support, and that couple hundred people turned into a couple thousand people within another few months. And that was 2005-ish. Around then, I got a call from WNYC in New York, and they had heard my show in iTunes and were impressed by it. And they said, "Are you really 25? Or 24, I guess I was at the time." And I said, "Yeah, I am really 24. And they said, "Are you really just doing this show by yourself?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "Wow, well, would you be willing to put together a best of and we could run it on the weekends?" And I said, "Yes." And they paid me, I don't remember, $500 or something like that, but it was pretty awesome. And over the course of the next 5 years or so, I went from that state of affairs to having my show be distributed by Public Radio International, being on a few dozen stations around the country. And when I discovered that being on a few dozen stations around the country would pay me a total of, I'm not kidding, even today, being on dozens of stations, including many major markets, $22,000 a year, I started a podcasting, that's public radio. I started a podcasting network and developed a sort of direct fundraising system from our podcast audience. And started several other comedy-based shows that now have as big audiences online as my public radio show does, and have put together a very good living from that. So my story essentially is of someone who tried desperately to get into the system in the normal way, who did everything. I mean, I went to college, I had a great public radio show, I did an internship, the whole 9 yards. Could not get a job to save my life. And so I just kept doing my radio show and made it into my own thing. And now I'm not only I'm actually, it's been 4 years that I've been with PRI. I'm still the youngest. Even if I had signed with PRI today, I would still be the youngest nationally syndicated public radio host ever. I think that Guy Raz, who hosts, well, I think Weekend Edition on NPR, is the youngest right now, and he's like the youngest besides me, and he's like 35. But I'm also one of the few who owns their show. I think Tavis Smiley owns his show. There's a couple other people who produce their show independently. But almost all public radio shows are produced either out of stations or by networks. And I produce my show in a studio in my house in Mount Washington, 15 minutes from here. And in addition to the shows that I produce, I also, as I mentioned, have a podcasting network of comedy podcasts that includes not just shows that I host and produce. I do a show with John Hodgman from The Daily Show. You might also know as the PC and the Mac versus PC commercials. And I also distribute several comedy podcasts that are produced by people all around the country who do comedy podcasts, and we help them with their fundraising and basically split their fundraising with them and do sort of public radio style underwriting / advertising with them and split that money with them. And, we take part of it to cover our fundraising costs and give them part of the money so that they can make money from the work that they're doing. And so for me, the story of digital's effect on media and the story of the lack of gatekeepers is not a story of the fall of standards and unproven correlation between people thinking that Obama is the Antichrist and the collapse of newspapers. I would say that the newspapers were doing really great when people thought black people and white people shouldn't drink from the same water fountains. But to me, it's the story of a new world in which if you can make a deep connection with an audience, you can find a way to make a living from that, no matter who, without having to go through a gatekeeper, without having to convince someone who has money and power that what you are doing is worthwhile. And I think that particularly because of the simple fact that the people who have money and power have particular perspectives. Even if it's just in my case, it's the power structure in public radio are largely people who came into public radio when it was growing at its fastest clip, which was the late 70s and early 80s. They all have a very distinctive generational perspective, and it's different from my generational perspective, and they've never heard of any of the guests on my show. And so they don't relate to it. And I often get the advice, just the other day, someone from PRI suggested to me, you should book some guests from Star Trek, the original series. Program directors really like Star Trek, the original series. I said, okay. George Takei seems like a cool guy. Maybe I'll book him. But, and so the fact that I don't have to do, translation to those people in power, whereas my dad's advice, my dad is a baby boomer and, came up in the, was a veteran and lived most of his adult life in the Vets Peace Movement, all he could offer me as advice was, well, they'll die. Because that's what he had to do. He had to wait until he was 45 or 50, and the people that called him a long hair died. So, for me, it's a really exciting opportunity that I can connect directly with people, and that they can, give me $5 a month, and that I can be, that I can, have a baby and buy food.
Jesse, did you want to show the video?
Oh yeah, in addition to all the crap that I just talked about that I do, I also you're probably wondering why I'm dressed like a sort of like a character from Dallas or something. I also do a video series about menswear called Put This On, a blog and video series about menswear. This is something that I'm very passionate about. And my background was in audio, but I thought this was a very visual thing. And so I wanted to do it in video. And we started this as a video series that we funded through Kickstarter, which you guys may be familiar with. It's a crowdsourced funding website for creative projects. And we went from a $1,500 budget for the first episode, me and my director, to a $15,000 budget for our first 6-episode series to a $70,000 budget for our second 6-episode series, which involved us. We just finished shooting it. We went to Milan, Milan, New York, and London to shoot 6 episodes. This has not yet premiered. This premieres on the 13th, but this is just a 1.5-minute segment of something that I actually haven't even seen yet.
My name is Jason Marshall. I play the saxophone, and I write and arrange music, and every so often I teach music privately. I dress to show respect for the environment. Okay, so I think playing music as an occupation is a privilege, and as such I try and respect the privilege, and inclination to play music. So, when I see people come out to listen to music, buy music, it's a conscious decision to spend money that they can spend somewhere else. So it's like whatever I can do to add to that experience, I do that. And
you could include the adults in a meaningful way, the parents, in the learning process of the students. Because the fact is, for a lot of the students that are the most low performing, their parents just don't show up.
Yeah. So it's interesting. If you look over the last 18 to 24 months in this country, we have had 3 very high-profile dealings with parents in schools across the country. So in the first, we had the Waiting for Superman movie, which sort of showcased 5 families throughout the country who were fighting to get their kids into a decent school. The second was actually right here in Compton, California, where a group of parents, led by Parent Revolution, I know that is here, to be the first group of parents who pulled the parent trigger, signed the petition to turn their school around. And then the last was a parent, a mother in Akron, Ohio, who falsified her residency documents to try to get her kids to be able to attend a higher performing state school. So let's look for a moment at how we treated those 3 groups of parents. The first group of parents were told, I'm sorry, there is no room for your children at these higher performing schools, you're stuck. In the second circumstance, these parents were harassed, they were threatened with deportation, I mean, everything under the sun. And in the third circumstance, we threw the lady in jail. So I do not think we are sending the message to parents of America that we want their involvement in the schools. That's the first thing. The second thing is, and this is what it comes down to ultimately, is the question that we have to answer as a society, are we going to hold children responsible for something that they have absolutely no control over, which is what their parents decide to do or not do? Because if we're saying at the front end that unless your parent comes in and comes to the conference and fills out the form and all these things, if your parents don't do that, then we're allowed to abrogate responsibility for your education. Then we might as well be telling a whole lot of kids all throughout millions of kids throughout this country that you need to stay home because your mom is not going to do this, and so you don't stand a fighting chance. Are we willing as a nation to subject children to a subpar education over something that their parents are either going to do or not do? I would say that as a country, we simply cannot do that. So can we encourage more parental involvement? Absolutely. Can we hold kids accountable and responsible for that? Absolutely not.
I think Michelle, I think really the message is we need both to happen, right? They're not mutually exclusive. And I know we have some members here. Ben, stand up real quick from Parent Revolution. We have members here from Families That Can. Are they here? Give them a shout out. So there's so many of you that are doing all you can to create an environment where parents can be fully engaged, and we're very thankful for that. We'll go in the back. Yes.
Hi, my name is Laura Fuller-Shaw. I was actually a therapist in the West Covina Public School District for some time and left that to run a private Montessori school because Montessori is an environment where students really do come first. And I'm looking at your tagline, and I think, of course I'm getting old so I can't really see, but it says a movement to transform public education. And I guess my question is, our public education system is based on a model of factory efficiency. It's not actually based on the development of people. So what are we going to do about that? Because it's unfair that children can attend private Montessori schools, a system that actually starts at birth and goes all the way through high school, that is actually based on development of children, and that it's not something that is offered. Even public Montessori charter schools can't really do what they do best because of the state doesn't recognize that kindergartners should be with 3 to 6 year olds, these sorts of things.
So part of it is about breaking out of the mold of the public education bureaucracy. I mean, people have this belief, people work in school districts, right? They're not bad people, but they have these certain belief sets. And if you don't fit into the box, that they can check, then they don't know what to do. Let me share with you an experience that we had specifically with Montessori schools in DC. We had one specific program in the city, Montessori program, very high quality program, and the number of families who applied every year to get their kids into this program were literally thousands. This is a district that was losing enrollment every year because people didn't have faith and confidence in our school district, and then you have this program where thousands of people are applying to come, and we didn't have enough spaces to actually accommodate everything. So I said, duh, let's build more of these Montessori programs, right? If this is what parents want, then why shouldn't we give them more of that? The biggest challenge that we faced in doing that was that in order to set up a Montessori program, it required a significant initial investment for both the right materials and the proper training and hiring of the staff. And people said, well, we don't have any money because look, we're losing all these kids. So we don't have the money to put into expensive programs like Montessori. What they didn't realize was unless we innovate. And unless we start providing the city with the kinds of programs that they want their kids to attend, then this cycle is going to continue on and on and on. So we actually started a few new Montessori programs. We put the initial investment in, and you know what? Almost immediately, it started to pay for itself and more because we were actually able to provide more families with what they wanted, and therefore lower our enrollment. So I think part of the issue is that oftentimes people are very short-sighted, right? If it costs us money and we don't have the money, then we can't do it. Instead of seeing a longer-term, gain to say, yes, we have to make an initial investment now, but it's going to benefit our system in the long run. And that's some of the kind of thinking that needs to change.
Right, well, so we're running out of time. I'd like to hear the question, and then hear the question. Let Michelle address those last two questions, and then we're going to close it out. So question and question.
I'd like to know, I agree with you wholeheartedly about the involvement of parents and the advocacy of parents for their child. However, what did you find in your work in Washington and currently as you're looking at solutions to the problem with education insofar as relationships between administration and teachers whom say were undesirables, the pollutants in the education system? Did you find that relationships also led to a lot of your struggles with trying to create, solutions to your problem? And the other part of that is parents who want to advocate find that it's such a high risk for retaliation against their child, particularly if they're not, as to whether or not that's going to contaminate their efforts and their opportunities further on in the school and education.
Okay, I got that one.
Mayor Kevin Johnson, I like you because in a basketball, unless they have a complete coordination and unity among the team, they cannot be champion, right?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Okay. In a tribute to Michelle Williams, obviously I'm from Korea, so if I may take 30 seconds in a tribute to Michelle Lee. Long time ago in Korea, there's a young, handsome, rich, smart guy who went to the greatest educator. I told him, I want to become somebody you cannot become, And a great educator, philosopher said, wait a minute, you want to be somebody I could not become? Yeah, tell me, I'm so good, I can be anybody. And a teacher thought for a while, I thought of an elementary school teacher. And a great educator, philosopher, elementary school teacher. And a young man said, oh, come on, anybody could become an elementary school teacher.